This is Steve Zeltzer with KPFA Pacifica Workweek Radio, and I'm with William Andrews, a writer and journalist here in Japan, and he covers developments in the labor movement, the left, and has been focusing on the growing repression here in Japan. So maybe you can, William, talk about the political situation here in Japan and some of the issues you've been covering.
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me. Japan has been going through a kind of strange period recently. We had, obviously, goes without saying, the Fukushima disaster, which was a massive social turmoil in Japan, social and cultural turmoil in Japan, which led to this new wave of protest movements. But it also led to, in many ways, to the downfall of the first serious opposition party we had to the LDP in years, certainly since the beginning of the 1990s. So,
how did that happen, and what was that party?
We had it was the Democratic Party, and it's a very typical case of Japan where a political party is actually born out of the kind of bits and pieces, the flotsam and jetsam of another party. And so it developed as an alternative to the LDP, which I'm sure you know has been in power for basically almost unbroken since the mid-50s. And it was led by some people who were very much from the political mainstream, some people who were more from the grassroots, particularly Naoto Kan, probably most famously. And so it was always a slightly uneasy party. And it positioned itself as being to the left of the centre, and to being a more liberal alternative to the LDP. And in many ways, it really did fulfill that description. But other ways, there was some issues with the rather motley crew of people who were running the party. And that's what really put its downfall, because in the end, infighting just destroyed the party. And so the whole time that Naoto Kan was trying to rally the country together and shifting towards its anti-nuclear stance of the party, at the very time when the party was going through this transition and arguably trying to listen to the voice of the people, actually people were plotting against him, and there was a leadership bid. He lost. Another leader took over called Noda, and then of course the party seemed incredibly weak and didn't seem to know what it was doing, and so inevitably people then, when the poll day, went back to who they trusted or they knew, which was the LDP. And the people who had come out to vote for the Democrats before didn't go out anymore because there was no one to vote for.
Now, when I was here a couple of years ago, former Prime Minister Kan on TV said that not only TEPCO but the U.S. government had plotted to get rid of him. What really happened with his removal?
I mean, I can't. I really wish I would like to know too. I wish I was a little fly on the wall of the Kasumi Kaseki offices in that day. I'm afraid I don't know the dirty secrets either. But put it this way: I think it's no secret that putting Naoto Kan aside for a second, there was also the governor of Tokyo, who was made no secret of the fact that he was against TEPCO and was interested in breaking it up, or it was no secret of the fact that he was not a friend of the executives. And yet, lo and behold, very quickly he was brought down by a financial scandal. These things are surely not wholly coincidental. Politicians all over the world are always involved in donations and money and things changing hands, which is often a little bit suspect. Why does it have to be this timing where, as soon as you become an enemy of this massive corporation, which is of course actually partly owned by Tokyo, suddenly you are made their enemy, and you suddenly become this media enemy? You get fingered in these scandals, and you also become a scapegoat, if you like. And I think something similar happened with Kan as well. I think it's very sad that I know he has his detractors, and I'm not necessarily a big fan of him, but certainly compared to who we've had since and who we had before, I think you'll have to be a very, very cynical person to say that he was at least not trying his best, and not a sincere person who came from a non-political dynasty, came from the grassroots. It wouldn't surprise me in the least if there were various powerful people who were, at the very least, smirking and pleased when he was brought down by political in-party fighting.
Now, the result of Fukushima was a growing unhappiness, anger about the nuclear power program here in Japan, and efforts to stop it. and Prime Minister Khan actually, as well as former Prime Minister Kazumi, said that they were against further nuclear power. The reaction of the government to those protests, I know there have been protests, long-going protests at the Prime Minister's house. It seems like the government hasn't at all cared about these. And why don't you talk about the reaction of the government to the protests and opposition to nuclear power in Japan?
Well, just one word basically, snub. I mean, it's been a complete. They've completely ignored the voice of the people. But this doesn't actually surprise me as much as you might think, because if you just look back at Japan's post-war history, and again we've seen massive protest movements against, often very particular single issue causes, and basically there's never ever been a case where the government has really listened to the voice of the people. I mean, you would think that hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets against the US-Japan Security Treaty in 1960, particularly also 1970, even more people actually. Nothing happened. I mean, I sound like a cynic, but I'm not trying to be cynical. I'm just literally saying the truth. Is they basically didn't listen at all, and they may have made some nuances in the way they developed policy in response to that. But essentially, nuts and bolts, there was no changes. They basically just went on ahead with their policy, and the same thing happened. Not just last year with the state security bills. Again, massive protests. Intense media, intense international opposition, and they made no move to even acknowledge it, let alone change what they were doing. And so the continued protests against nuclear power, and it happens still now. There are still regular Friday night visuals outside the cantate to the Prime Minister's residence. I unfortunately, and again, I'm not being cynical, but I really don't see it really ever affecting what the government will do, just because. Again, that's not for me to be cynical. It's just literally, they've never ever really shown themselves interested in true democracy and democratic voice. And
the issue of press freedom and repression against the press, journalists, for reporting on some of the developments. The recent Kyushu earthquake, apparently the head of the NHK told that journalist and his operation that they shouldn't disturb people, get them worried. And David Kaye's recent report from the UN that in fact journalists here are being victimized because they're actually reporting on what's going on. Is there truth to that?
Well, I don't work directly at a large Japanese media organization, so I can't claim from direct experience. But everything I read and everything I hear indicates that is the case. Or if it's not the case right now, it's certainly heading very much in that direction. I mean, there's been a lot of fuss made, at least overseas, about how Japan's rankings in media freedom has declined year on for the last few years, which I find quite shocking for a country which is the third biggest economy in the world and ostensibly a democracy. In Japan,
what do you mean ostensibly?
Well, I mean, it's on Wikipedia, all these other people, Japan is described as democracy, but I think, if you look at voter turnouts and you look at the complete gap between Parliament and the average voter, and you look at the dynastic nature of the main political parties, I think it doesn't take much of a leap to describe Japan as a very much troubled democracy, as before we even get into the nitty-gritty. So, in terms of media freedom, I think there's several issues here. A lot of people talk about Japanese culture, and again, it gets very essentialist. You start making these big generalizations, and just to try and avoid doing that. But people do talk about this idea of meiwaku, the idea of causing trouble for someone, and you should always avoid doing that to create a harmonious situation where everyone can get along together. I mean, that's one of these sort of stereotypes of Japan, and I don't think it's wholly untrue. I don't think it's the whole truth. That also applies to, obviously, the media. And you mentioned there about not annoying people in Kumoto, and this sort of idea that when you go and interview someone, you should not ask too difficult questions in case you accidentally make trouble for them, and then obviously make trouble for your relationship with them as well in the future. But the kind of extension of that, or the corollary of that, if you like, is that you have these Kisha clubs, these reporter clubs, where the mainstream newspaper or media organizations have access to the press conferences with the main politicians, and they are very conscious of this this exclusive access, and they don't want to do anything which might jeopardize their position. And as that was very, very much brought to the fore in the aftermath of the Fukushima crisis, where basically no one was asking these difficult questions. And it was actually the independent journalists who didn't have access to these exclusive conferences, and they were the ones asking online and in other events, why is no one asking TEPCO or asking the government about the leaks and things like that? And these things, which to a European like myself are quite, commonsensical. And of course, of course, you should ask a politician a direct question about that. And if they can't answer it, well, then they should try and find out. But that isn't necessarily the case for a lot of these people who have these quite intricate relationships at these Keisha clubs where they don't want to jeopardize. I think it has definitely changed a bit. I think when the government pushed through its state secrets law, that was heavily criticized, heavily opposed by basically the media across the political spectrum.
Even the New York Times opposed it.
Yeah, I think obviously foreign media as well. I think we are seeing definitely some more vocal opposition to the government in that sense, and the media, I think, is slowly cottoning on that they are in danger of being gagged even more than they are. I guess you could say the gagging now will be top down as opposed to being self-censorship. It will actually could potentially now be, actually government-imposed censorship, which. So as a British person, I can't think of anything like it in recent history. It reminds me of sort of, the Cold War era when the government might say that this is, we can't write this because it might endanger us, the Russians. It's that kind of level of paranoia and hysteria going back to the 60s or 70s or something. But in Japan, that could well be a reality quite soon. The government then decides that, this you can't write about. It could well be covered quite easily by this new legislation they passed. And I think finally the media have cottoned onto this. But it's a little bit too little too late. On the other hand, there is a slight different interpretation, which is that, so you have the boring, dusty mainstream media who go to these Keisha clubs, the mainstream political press conferences. Okay, forget them. There's actually quite a lively underbody. There's the weekly tabloids. Well, we call them tabloids in the West. Actually, it's not a completely accurate label to call them, but these are weekly magazines that come out, and they are not answerable to anyone really. They chase down celebrities. They use paparazzi shots. They don't have to be nice to the entertainment offices, the agencies, these big, powerful agencies, because they just use their own photos. They don't need official ones. So they are, happy to chase down scandals, and they won't be gagged. And recently, there have been several very, very high-profile scandals, political, but also entertainment, that have been broken by particularly two of these weeklies, and that, in a sense, is a sign of a very healthy media culture, where the press is very happy to go out with guns blazing and go out. I mean, of course, it's also a little bit troublesome, because you could say that they're picking on certain people and almost like victimizing them, which is perhaps arguably unfair. But it's no worse than most of the other tabloid media does, certainly in Britain, where I come from. So in some ways, I was quite pleased to see this sort of this lively, bustling slew of articles we've seen recently, which have essentially destroyed the career of several people. Obviously, they because of what they were doing, they aren't victims or anything, because they were essentially being hypocrites, and they were exposed. So you could argue that is a sign of something there, some energy that's there, and it's waiting to be tapped into if it's given the right platform.
And you've been writing about the attack on repression on the left. Maybe you can talk about the police, the role of the police, secret police, and the roundups, the attacks on students at Kyoto University. What's going on as far as the repression by the Japanese police and the authorities?
Well, in some ways, nothing new. Actually, what we're seeing right now is very much a kind of same old in some ways.
And what is that?
So that will basically be, I still find quite shocking, is, so for example, we go to a demo in Japan, particularly a left-wing demo, and there will often be more police than there are demonstrators. And that's not to say, that's not because it's a very bad turnout of demonstrators, it's just simply because particularly these established, what you might say, far left or I would call radical groups, they have a history, it's true, they do have a history, but even when they are now very clearly focused on, for example, only labour issues, they're not dangerous, as you just, as a glimpse at the demographic of the demonstrators, or a glimpse at the demographic of the protests will reveal, these people are far too old to be causing trouble, actual violence. But that being said, you will find masses of security police taking pictures of everyone who attends. My pictures have been taken many times, just because I happen to be there, not because I hope not because they suspect I'm, going to be throwing a bomb at anyone anytime soon, which is certainly not on my list of priorities. So that's a continuous. That's the taking a standard. That's a typical tactic they use. So the recent arrests we've been seeing, the roundups, are merely an extension of the kind of tactics they always use to harass and to try to whittle away at the power the power these groups have, power in terms of resources and people, of course. They even going back in history, it's always been the same. Basically, they use very small crimes or allegations of crime to arrest people, on the hope that they will then be able to get them to basically confess, and then to basically allow them to catch the bigger fish.
Sounds like a police state.
I mean, I wouldn't like to use that word lightly, but certainly the first time I attended a demonstration of, it was a union demonstration, and it was a union that's associated with a so-called far-left group.
Was that Doro-Chiba?
It was a Doro-Chiba, yes. It was held in Shinjuku in a park, and I remember the first time I was just an observer actually, and I remember being really quite shocked by the number of riot police and riot police vans, and then also the security police who wear no uniform, but it's obvious who they are, and who are just sitting there with their notebooks making notes of all the people and what's said. I found that genuinely quite shocking. I come from the UK, which has an incredibly high amount of surveillance, as I'm sure you know, probably the most in the world, particularly in London, which is a kind of direct legacy of the IRA bombing campaign. And so I'm used to these kind of issues of police state and surveillance and, how much that affects our basic human rights. These issues are not new to me, so I shouldn't have been so shocked easily. I think I was just shocked because it was so blatant. And at least in the UK, because it's done by cameras, it's perhaps a little bit more subtle, if you like. But this was so in your face, and they were literally sort of surrounding the demo, and so it was actually quite hard to get into it, just to go and sit down and watch. And that's obviously, again, another tactic. They try to make these people appear like they are social freaks, and when all they're doing is basically having a small demo about basic labour rights, which shouldn't be too shocking, actually. So these tactics are constant, and they are unapologetic. And I never see anyone in the mainstream media criticising this at all, or even aware of this.
But does the mainstream media even cover these events?
Oh, not at all, no. I think I was at, about a year ago, I was at a rally held to do with the anti-Narita airport, the so-called Censorship movement, and it was the first one that had been held actually in Narita City for many years. And so because of that, there was I think one mainstream media journalist was there doing a couple of interviews. So there was occasionally some interest in covering the movements to a certain extent, but again, no one sort of seems to question the fact that, why are there so many security police taking pictures, and isn't that a little bit repressive? And of course, maybe some people might argue that no, because these groups have histories of violence, so it's perfectly legitimate. Okay, that's fair enough. That's an argument you might have, but no one even voices that argument in public either. It's always very interesting when the police do make these kind of raids, which always seem a little bit sporadic and out of the blue, where they suddenly will decide to raid a facility associated with one of these groups, and they will, of course, in advance, telephone various media organizations who they know will cover it. And of course, they line up and they get their big drill out and they film them cutting into the metal door of the headquarters of the political group they are going to raid now. It's all very dramatic and very exciting. It's like some sort of, Hollywood movie or something. But it's all just a performance, because inside the people, they know the drill, they're just waiting. They hear the door locked, of course, they're not going to open the door to them, but at the same time, they're not resisting anything. But this whole thing is just done as a performance, as a kind of charade, if you like, to try and perpetuate the myth that these groups are dangerous still, and they should be feared. Now, whether or not you think they are so dangerous, of course, I understand some people do think that. But again, no one even really debates this or not. And so these particular student these student arrests, I think, because we're talking here about the 6 students who were arrested, in particular in connection with a very small, limited strike that was held at Kyoto University a few months ago. They were actually, the 6 were released without charge, I might actually add, which just shows how ridiculous it was, and they couldn't even pin anything on them. That particularly is interesting to me because, it comes as part of a series of repressive actions against left-wing groups recently in Japan, particularly in the last 18 months or so. During the height of the protests against the state security legislation, and now, of course, as we go towards the G7 or G6, which one or the other, in Issei, the summit in Issei, where again the state is on high alert for anything. So it falls into that sequence, if you like. But also, there's another interesting parallel to what's happened. The same time as last year, it's calmed down quite a lot since, but last year particularly there was a lot of hype in the mainstream media where they were glamorizing and eulogizing and glorifying student activists. Obviously, most famously is the Sealds, who are these, very attractive, most of them, clean-looking, friendly, liberal-minded, mostly going to private colleges, mostly English-speaking as well, very metropolitan student activists who were actually not really arguing for particularly cogent or particularly powerful points, but their activism was very well mobilized and well organized, and they managed to be very successful in what they were doing. The media were really fascinated by these people, and they got a huge amount of mainstream media coverage. And it's almost like, wow, the Japanese student activism has been reborn, but actually it was already there. It just wasn't quite as clean and attractive as it was before. But either way, this new face, they were fascinated by it, and it was one of every year in Japan, the mainstream media chooses a list of buzzwords from the year that sort of sum up the year, and Seals was one of those. So it was given a sort of stamp of approval, of something really interesting and worthwhile that happened during the year. So at the same time, I'd say there's very, very positive reception of student activism. Whatever you think of Seals politics or not, it was a very positive, overall very positive reaction politically as well, because the mainstream political parties, the opposition parties, were very positive towards them. At the same time as it's happening, you have this ridiculous situation where, basically some kids in their sort of 20s have a sort of mini strike in university, and that's suddenly seen as, somehow illegal. And so how can you possibly have a society that glorifies and thinks these kids who are being political are wonderful on the one hand, on the other hand think, oh no, hang on a minute, these ones no, you can't have these ones being political. And it's clearly it's because the people who headed the strike in Kyoto University, they were much more left wing. I mean, they were associated with a so-called far left, some might say extremist group. I wouldn't ever use that word myself, but it's clear that they were being penalised for the degree of their political beliefs, and I think that's very strange and very worrying as well.
And there were draft notices sent to young people recently that caused the protest of high school students and other youth here against war Is there a growing anger among young people as far as militarization in Japan?
These things are very hard to measure in terms of numbers. I think, yes, there clearly is. Maybe anger is also the wrong word, though. Certainly there's a growing sense of fear and disquiet. It's very hard to measure these things. No one does proper surveys of this. But we are seeing more high school students being involved, that's for sure. One of the sort of offshoots of SEALs actually is one such high school-based group. And they've actually kind of taken on the mantle now because SEALs are officially disbanding. And so this high school group is going to become one of the main kind of flag bearers of their movements. So I think that's, again, very positive. At the same time as that, you then have the Education Ministry confirmed in January that high school students who are going to take part in demonstrations have to get permission from their school. That was announced, officially, which is an absolutely absurd suggestion. Why should students, have to get permission? So, again, with these weird contradictions. So the upcoming election in the summer for the upper house, the voting age has been lowered to 18. So again, the government's saying, "Oh, we're trying to emancipate the young people and get rid of this voter apathy amongst the young." At the same time as doing that, you have this thing, "Oh, no, hang on a minute, you can't go on the street and demonstrate unless you get permission from your teacher." And so it's obviously kind of a contradiction there. So I think young people are waking up to this. Quite whether it will die away in a year's time or whether it will lead to something bigger and stronger and more important is very much, we're at a crossroads right now. And I think also this election will be interesting. How many young people aged 18 and 19 actually vote, and who they vote for will be very interesting to see. I mean, the government and the people in charge of self-defense forces are very clever, and they make use of celebrities and so-called idols who are popular with the young to be the face of their recruitment posters and of their various advertising campaigns. That's very cleverly done. They know that they can appeal to people through these people that have a following, have fans amongst the young. They also know that the self-defense forces, for example, have developed a very good reputation because of their work in the disaster relief, as we've seen most recently in Kumamoto Prefecture. People who join the SDF, they do so. I can't speak for everyone who does it, but I'm sure they do it because they want to be directly involved in helping people in those situations. Of course, they also know they have to defend Japan in the very unlikely situation they is ever attacked by another country. But then, of course, it's also the US treaty, which is supposed to also be involved in protecting Japan. So really, their main job should be, going out and helping ordinary citizens who have suffered from a flood or an earthquake or volcanic eruption. And so that's also, that image was again also had a big boost after 3/11, Fukushima, and the Tohoku tsunami. So that image is also exploited and used to appeal to young people that join the STF and help people. But at the same time, in the backgrounds, in the political, the political chess room, if you like, where things are decided without consulting the public, you have a situation where the SDF itself is being radically changed, and what the SDF could be mobilized to do could well be, in the future, not going to help people in Kumamoto. It could well be going to fight an enemy of an ally of Japan. Obviously, most likely ISIS, something like that. And that is something that people in the SDF now are also very scared about, because they didn't sign up for going off to fight Islamic terrorists or to even fight in a war. And so they're very clever in the way they're oiling the PR machine. That they bring people in, but they don't scare them off. And I hope that doesn't deceive people, because obviously the young are susceptible to these kind of advertising campaigns. So we're at a bit of a crossroads. I want to wait to the election and then what happens after the election, whether that is an indication of a renewal of, well, not even a renewal, a birth of young voter activity, or whether it just was a purely empty gesture by the government to try to claim they're being nice and emancipating young people. But in fact, because there is a more cynical side to this whole lowering the voter age could well just be a first step towards dealing with minors, people who are under 20. Japan, you become an adult at 20. So people who are under that age and they commit a crime, they're dealt with as a minor. So they can't be tried under the same conditions as an adult. Of course, if the voter age is brought down to 18, that sets a potential precedent for, if you're 18, commit a crime, being then tried as an adult. Certainly, if you now commit a crime against the election laws as an 18-year-old during the upcoming election, that's obviously you are violating the election laws. And that could well be in the future where we have these high-profile murder cases or high-profile kidnapping cases where the perpetrator, or the alleged perpetrator, is underage. It may well be the situation where they actually end up being tried as a normal adult, because now the LDP has set this precedent where actually, no, 18 is now the normal adult age. So that could well be an ulterior motive, potentially. But, I can't speak for the government.
Anyway, William, you've also covered the issue of political prisoner Fumiaki Hoshino. Why don't you talk about his case and your coverage of it?
Well, it's a very long story where to start, but Fumiaki Hoshino is arguably the longest-serving political prisoner in the world. I know there are perhaps different stats on this, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to not describe him as a political prisoner. He was a marked man already. He was a veteran activist in several campaigns during the late 60s and early 70s. The police already knew who he was, and they were wanting to nab him somehow. They got their chance when he was one of the activists involved in a large-scale political action in Shibuya in 1971. And again, it's a loaded word, but essentially the action did descend into what was probably described as a riot, or something close to a riot. At least certainly at certain areas of the action were, riot conditions. And during the course of this, a riot police officer did die. He was. Now, there are many issues, of course, of this. How do you possibly ever claim to be able to say this person did it when there are so many people involved? There's no actual footage of the act. How can you possibly narrow it down and say no, this person was the person who killed that police officer? It's absolutely impossible. There's no way you can categorically say that. However, Hoshino was known, and he was already wanted, and he was the leader of that particular group of demonstrators, and where the death did take place. He was. No one was actually arrested for that crime on the day itself, I might add. Later on, as the police were arresting other people on other various charges, they then began to build their case and realized they can finger Hoshino and other people for this death. Hoshino he went underground for a long time, and during this time they arrested more and more people. This is during the first half of the 70s in Japan, which were incredibly turbulent. A lot of violence, a lot of militant actions, a lot of arrests, and they were building a case against him. And they eventually had 5 confessions. Japanese confessions are essentially, extracted by force. It may not necessarily be actual violence exerted on the prisoner or the arrested person, but for example, there's no lawyer present during the very, very long hours and hours of interviews every day, and they can hold suspects for many, many days There's a sort of 23-day period which are going to be extended by rearrest. It's an incredible situation, incredible amount of isolation, where they build cases and they try to extract confessions. So again, these people were very, very young. They were minors, and they were basically building. They would write the confession for them, and eventually they would say, "This is the person who did it. He was wearing these clothes. That was the person who killed him." Right? So this kind of twisted logic was the way that they built a case against Hoshino with these arguably, forced confessions. When they eventually did arrest him and brought him to trial, we should have these confessions were the people who confessed then denied these confessions in court itself. They did not stick to them. However, in Japanese court system, that's still allowed. The confessions still stand, and there was essentially no actual evidence against him. There's all kinds of complicated story here to do with the clothing he was wearing, the clothes that he was accused of wearing, and things to do with his stick that he was holding, and there's quite a lot of complicated details to the story, but the essential detail is that the essential thing to remember is there was basically no evidence. Certainly not to the extent that you could say, there's not a shadow of a doubt it was him, but that's definitely not the case. There was much more than a shadow of a doubt. There's a lot of doubt, a lot of ambiguity. I can't really think of any genuine trial that will allow him to be found guilty of the death of causing the death of this police officer, but he was. And again, there were multiple trials and retrials. And first, he was sentenced for a certain amount of time, but the prosecution appealed, because in Japan, prosecutions can also appeal a sentence if they think it's too lenient, as of course did the defense as well. And then in the second trial, he was then again found guilty, and this time he was given an indefinite life sentence, which again is remarkable for such a kind of ambiguous and conflicted case to be given such a lengthy, basically a death sentence, because they're basically saying he can't come out of prison ever. So that's been going on, since the trials were happening in the 70s and 80s, and there's still now the defense committee, his support group, are still now mounting many, many legal campaigns, both against his treatment in prison, so private cases, private suits, because of the way that he's treated in prison, and the way that his family is treated, where the letters censored, as well as, of course, appealing against the actual court decisions. He's now an elderly man. He's now in his 70s. And, even though they are building more and more evidence for his defense, there are still all kinds of very, very shocking developments on the prosecution side, where they claim to have lost evidence, or they refuse to release what they are claiming as evidence. Because in Japan, certain evidence is sealed and it's not made public. Again, which seems remarkable to many people, certainly to myself. And so they still continue this defense committee still continues this very uphill struggle against the stubbornness of the prosecution to abide by even the very, very basic standards of judicial system in most other countries. I mean, Japan's judicial system has come under a lot of criticism by Amnesty International, by the foreign press, for firstly the death row prisoners, but also for conditions under which prisoners are kept, as well as actually the way that the court cases are actually tried itself, behind closed doors, with only with the judges. And they've introduced kind of juries fairly recently, but again, it's only limited. And there's all kinds of other issues to do with how these police conversations, the interrogations with suspects for long periods of time. There, only recently they've introduced limited tape recording of them. Before it was all off, all secret. So we've seen some developments, and I think the Hoshino case, however you feel about it, really represents sort of a lot of these issues that are chronically wrong with the Japanese justice system, and I think it really exposes a lot of these issues. And so that sense, I think it's very much a model for people to look at, people to study, to learn more about the plight of these accused, because the last few years, several very prominent suspects, prisoners, were released after having been found to be falsely imprisoned. Several of them were very, very prominent cases, but they were all non-political. They were all murder cases and things like that. The thing with Hoshino, again, it's politically motivated. He was a member of a revolutionary group. He was campaigning for very, very revolutionary causes. So there can be no doubt that the lack of media coverage, the almost complete lack of media coverage compared to these other cases of alleged, false imprisonment, must represent, again, a bias against his political leanings, which I also find very troubling.
And you wrote an article in the Japan Times about this case. What was the response to the article?
Oh, very, very good, actually. I was very pleased with the response. Online it got quite a good response. Obviously, some people were obviously going to be a little bit annoyed about any article that deals with the left wing and will be a bit negative. But in general, I think it was very positive. And again, because it came out at this time of several other people who were being released after being forced in prison for a long time. So it had a very interesting time. And I wrote the article because they just released a book about the case. And it was a very good kind of introduction to what had been happening over the last, at that point, decades of their activities. So that was my kind of simulation to write the article. And so the timing was very fortuitous, actually. Of course, it wasn't planned necessarily. I think I actually got a letter. The Japan Times received a letter addressed to me, which they then forwarded on to me, which was from someone who was a contemporary of Hoshino, and he remembered the demonstrations from that time very, very well. They were not actually a member of one of his support groups per se. They weren't a friend or anything, but they were a sympathizer, and they'd been a kind of silent onlooker on his case for a long time, and they were very happy that it had got a relatively long exposure in English in an article like that, and they were pleased to see that finally there was some media attention for his case. And I was actually very touched that somehow my modest contribution had seemed to got the kind of response from people from the period seemed to like. Of course, it's not just about the people from the period; it's about people now who are younger, who knew nothing about that period and nothing about the case. We need to get the message out to them that there is this incredible, long-running case that's out there of very, very dubious imprisonment.